Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to gather here this evening for EP Culture Conversations Part 2. So this is the start of a series of discussions and talks in the gallery, responding to the exhibition that surrounds us. Whose gallery is it anyway? Which has seen an extraordinary mix of different sorts of artists of all ages and at all stages of their creative progression, bringing works and curating works in this space, which has been really enjoyable to witness. So my name is Janet Archer. Welcome. I'm the Chief Executive here at Edinburgh Printmakers. And I just want to say welcome to everybody online. I know that we've got some people who have joined us online, and what I'd like to do is to introduce this talk and then to introduce the speakers, and then I'm going to ask them some questions, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about that, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to bring in audience questions and points of view as well. So this conversation is all about what does it mean to be a museum in Scotland in 2024, and how should Edinburgh Printmakers approach making its collection available to the public and researchers as a new museum in Fountainbridge. So,
can you help me? I can't hear anything.
So we've got somebody just engaging online who's stuck, or talking to somebody else that isn't in our conversation. Well, that's okay.
Did they say they couldn't hear anything?
I think it's possibly they were talking to somebody else, but let's not worry. We're a community. We approached Museums Galleries Scotland a few years ago to have a conversation about whether or not we might become a museum. And we were lucky enough to receive some Museums and Galleries Scotland funding, resilience funding, in the wake of the pandemic, which was very helpful to us. And that sort of triggered a set of thoughts which had emerged out of our original application for National Lottery Heritage funding for the capital refurbishment of this building. That actually, as an organisation that has got almost 60 years of history, and a very fine collection of works made by artists, some really prominent artists from across Scotland, that we should really think seriously about our role as a museum in caring for that collection, and also our role as an institution that has a duty of care to the public of generations of the future in building the heritage of the future. So we started to think about what would it mean for us to be a museum. We're using the International Council of Museums definition, which is a museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. So today we're going to discuss exactly what that might mean for this community of Edinburgh Printmakers, and what we perhaps might want to see out of thinking about a print collection, but also a museum in the sense of a cultural institution, a new location in the city, but very much rooted in a strong industrial past, and that sort of lives and breathes in the architecture of this building, which was a really important place for people to come and connect with as part of their daily lives and indeed, their daily work. So this site, if you're not aware, and we're the last vestiges of it, we saw about 8,000 people employed in this location at a certain point in this building's history, which is quite incredible that people used to come, and we were the resource, if you like, in terms of work for the area, and people came here and they made things with their hands. Initially silk, then rubber, and then it became a brewery, and now people make prints. So there's something rather beautiful about that continuation of physical endeavour, which takes place on this site that we very much want to connect to. So I'll introduce our panellists. So I'm going to read out their biographies, which they've kindly provided to us. So Meg Dolan So Meg is our one of the collections development managers at Edinburgh Printmakers, where she was also part of the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities doctoral intern in 2023. She's on the board of Emerging Museums Professional Scotland and the forthcoming Museum of Ukrainian Craft and Culture Scotland. She holds a BFA in photography, a master's in history, and a research master's in collections and curating practices from the Edinburgh College of Art. She's currently finishing a PhD in art history at the University of St Andrews, where she researches visual interpretations of archetypal female characters in early British and Irish narrative photography. She's worked in various capacities with many museums and archives, including the Museum of Everyday Life in Vermont, USA, and the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the National Library of Scotland, the Centre for Research Collections at the University of Edinburgh, the Wardlaw and Bell Pettigrew Museums at University of St Andrews, and the Edinburgh Dog and Cat Home Archive. Welcome, Meg. So next to Meg, we have Nkem Okwachimi. He's a Glasgow-based, South London-born Scottish-Nigerian artist and printmaker. We're just delighted to have you here today. We're also thrilled that we're going to be seeing two Nigerian artists, Scottish-Nigerian British artists showing work here this summer, Ade Adesina and Tayo Adekunle. Just a quick plug for our next show. Nkem uses printmaking, photography, and textile to produce both his African-influenced designs and studio prints through his brand, MRLC. The context of Okwachimi's work is documenting and celebrating his identity. He believes that artists narrate a personal story using themselves, their history, and their surroundings to create a unique view of our existence. And our final panelist for this evening is Fredrika Voigt, who we welcome warmly. Fredrika is a museum professional with 30 years of experience, fascinated by how museum collections encapsulate human thinking and concept. Her research investigates the perspectives of individuals involved in the British Empire in India and represented in the collection of National Museum Scotland in Edinburgh. Fredrika's scholarship has informed special exhibitions, displays in permanent galleries, and collaborations with South Asian communities. Current projects include a cross-disciplinary study of 18th century paintings from Murshidabad to shed new light on interactions between local artists and European customers in a co-edited special issue, which is forthcoming, which brings together academic and curatorial views on the opportunities and challenges for South Asian collections in European museums in the 21st century. And at the National Museums of Scotland, she's responsible for the collections in West, South, and Southeast Asia. So that's our panel, and what a brilliant group of people to come together. The first question I'm going to ask all of you. So what does a museum mean to you, and why are they important for society? I'm going to ask Nkem what you think.
Well, I think first of all, memories of going to a museum, I think was when I was about 10 years old to see Tutankhamun, and it's always like always like a good family day out. And I kind of remember with museums, even like till maybe when I was a teenager, and when I was looking into like parts of my dad's culture, I was finding out about the Benin bronzes. And so one trip when I went down to visit my dad, we went to the National Museum there and got to see it all there, and it was very good. And yeah, very nice memory to have, which was I think back in 2015 now, which is quite funny thinking about it. But it's I think that's a big kind of part. It's always like a nice excuse to go out there and take in information and kind of share it out and share your experience to also the audience as well.
Brilliant. Fredrika?
Well, for me, it's probably in the first instance the place where I work, but from that perspective, what's important about museums is I think they are archives of people's experiences, the skills, of the thinking that has changed over time. So they capture this, they preserve it, and make it accessible to people. And if you think about the core of many museums being a collection, it's also important to acknowledge that they are not only historical preservation of archives, but then they also have a contemporary element to it. So they change, they grow, you add to it. And they can be historical objects, but also contemporary art. And I think this mixture is important to keep accessible for everyone. So it's the place where people come together for learning and exchange.
Thank you. And Meg, what in thinking about that contemporary aspect, which you're very immersed in at the moment, what's your take on museums, and crucially, why do you think they're really important for society?
So I think, like Kim, a lot of my childhood memories, I had a family that loved going to museums. And as I sort of got older and started going to more specific museum, you've got like the big national scale museum where you go and you see the Tutankhamun, and but then I started going to ones that were very like site specific, a lot more like ours, like organizational museums and museums of specific art movements and things like that. And I think what I really love about museums is how they really reflect the people that are around them. Kind of like Frederica was saying. So I think they're really important for society in that, whether it's a large museum or a small museum, that they really represent the people who are going there to enjoy them. And also, I think it's a great bonus if they represent the people who are making them and enjoying them as well. And what we're really trying to do here is start to think of our collection like a reflection of our history and what it's been for the past almost 60 years. Yeah, I think that's why museums are important. It's important to remember.
So I always think of museums as a place of discovery. I think there is a museum somewhere called the Discovery in Newcastle, I think. Have you ever, this is a question that you haven't pre-prepared, but I'm interested in whether you've ever discovered something in a museum that you hadn't anticipated that you would, that's made you think or been useful in any sort of a way in terms of your lives.
I think every time I go to a museum, there's always something new, and our lives are so interwoven with so many different elements of history and community and everything around us. Like there's always something you can take away from a museum, that even if it's just learning where your tinfoil comes from or something like that. Yeah, I think every time I go to a museum, I learn something that I use. I don't know.
I really like to go to local museums. These are the places where you can make discoveries that you didn't expect would have happened in a place, and change it. It has the potential to change your perspective on a particular place. So.
Yeah, the same for me. I think, well, recently I had the commission from the Perth Museum to do a banner on the story of Joseph Knight, and I actually had no idea about Joseph Knight around that time, a few years ago. To be honest, I was just saying that to you earlier. I didn't actually know there were Black people in Scotland around that time. So for me personally, especially moving from London up here and finding identities as a mixed race Scottish Nigerian, it was like a big eye opener, especially living in Dundee. So a lot of a lot of things started clicking in together, and kind of broaden my perspective on just life and the world in general.
So I'm going to move us on. So I think you've touched on this, Frederica, in relation to the role that museums play. So not just about preserving the past and providing public access to that, but also the really important local community role that museums can offer in bringing people together, in promoting learning. Can you think of interesting examples of things that, in your experience, museums have done which have made a real difference to people's lives in different local communities?
Well, I guess I'm going to promote a little bit my own work. So I have recently worked with my colleague in learning and engagement, Jane Miller, on a project, South Asian Stories, that was actually involving the South Asian community in Edinburgh, and we continue to work with them, but this project was particularly coming from their experience and on their idea and demand in a way to include their views into the interpretation of our objects. So what we have, or what they have created, we have only facilitated the process, is a trail of 16 stories on objects that are on display in the museum. So on objects that mean something to their lives, that can come from a Scottish context or from South Asia. And their stories are available now on our website, but also on a shorter trail that people can pick up when they come to the museum. And they will find an alternative interpretation to the curatorial interpretation. And that is really something that I value very much, because we need to keep in mind that whatever we say is only one facet, and sometimes in 25 words, what can you say about an object in a label? So to have these different perspectives and stories about objects that are in the museum and entered the museum for very different purposes has increased very much what we can show people, and encourage our visitors, I think, even to think more independently about what these objects mean to them.
Yeah, so that chimes very well with what we're doing here in a way, in people bringing things that are important to them into the space. So we in this area are really interested in the fact that Fountainbridge and the surrounding areas are really diversifying in terms of the ethnicity of people who live and visit and work here. We've done a lot of work with different communities in different ways. From your experience of working in Scotland, what sort of top tips would you give us in terms of how we might engage with the different communities that are now settling and making Scotland their home? What should we do?
Honestly, like, just make it like a very flexible, open kind of platform for any groups to really come in from. Even I think when it's community, you kind of need to have, of course, look out for the minorities from my perspective, but also make sure the majorities are there, so everyone can be included, from whether it's race, gender, like everything where it comes into, and especially that working class. I think I personally feel sometimes can be such a kind of two bird, one stone situation where you can bring all these different groups in. So I think that's something I'm very personal to myself, coming from Croydon and moving to Dundee and then to Glasgow and around there, like taking in a lot of inspiration from my environments, which kind of helped me like make my work, and to have like the kind of labor side of it to actually just stick on at it. So like I think that can really work and incorporating both sides when it pardon me, when it comes in all together. So I think honestly that would be great, and stuff like workshops for young people coming in here, and maybe in areas where people don't get the opportunity to go into a museum or get to see art. I think that could be something beautiful starting up there.
Yeah, and I was going to drill you a little bit more on that, because often we're in an interesting structure here where we're recessed slightly from the streetscape. So it's very easy for people to walk past and not necessarily look in. Are there things that you think we could do to welcome people more deeply?
Yeah, definitely. Well, like what I was saying there, with like there's loads of groups and charities in Scotland and Edinburgh based, and I think inviting these groups, no matter what majority or minority it is, really helps to glue everyone together and to kind of make it a society. And like I sometimes feel like art can be a bit of a privileged state, to be honest, to actually be exposed into it. And I find myself very fortunate to actually have been in this environment as well. But I mean, even where I grew up in London, loads of my friends didn't really get the privilege to really get shown. We were kind of really told maybe be a footballer or you could be a rapper or something, but it's very pigeonholed in even those two industries. And I think that's something I really want to do myself in my career while doing workshops, is to, encourage people, and it brings a whole new perspective into like a whole industry, you know what I mean, when it comes in there. When I was in uni, like for an example, very much not involved, but around the LGBT community. When I was in Dundee and Croydon, it wasn't really that much exposure out there at all. So like it was quite nice to actually take in, you know, this one like group and actually be quite impressed at like how like they act around and are quite collectively proactive together. And I think that's what everyone can really take like inspiration from in the end. So I'd kind of like to flip it and do my own little version of that. And I don't know, maybe some of my friends' kids in time, I'm going to try and get them into screen printing, and always forcing my nieces and nephews to get into lino cutting and stuff. So like I'm trying to do my best on that side to engage them into that, and just give it like the option from, because it can always be like from a hobby then to then professional way of doing it. And I think that is something I think that could be really important, showing even just having a workshop with very simple DIY setup where you can just like screw the screens onto here, get them to just do a couple prints, and then you can introduce the ones that really like the process to the print studio, and then just leave them at it and see where they go in their journey.
Yeah. And tell us a bit about your practice and what you have done in terms of engagement.
So I was studied at GSA from 2018 and I graduated in 2022. And I've had a bit of a journey. So I came from, I learned screen printing at DCA in Dundee about 10 years ago now, which is quite funny thinking about it. But I was about 18 at the time, left school, didn't really know what I was wanting to do, you know, so had a little part-time job printing in there. Luckily got involved into cashback schemes, which I think is also a very good thing, is make sure there's funding for young people to, I mean, me and my friend, throughout the summer, we got invited to the DCA, and we just got, it was like the world was our oyster in there. They were just like, you're just getting funded to learn about screen printing, etching, photography, anything that was accessible in there. And it was like really, really fun, to be honest. So like kind of missed those times there. So from that, I had money to start my own business. I have my clothing brand MRLC, which is very much, it was a collaboration with my mum at the start, and she used to be an artist. So I commissioned her to do a design, which I call now the Black Madonna, but I put MRLC, her initials, for that artist recognition. Then I'm a big mummy's boy, to be honest. So like, I think that's quite obvious, but like it was a big kind of way of like just starting off my own little brand. And I don't think I was that like conscious about my research that I really liked. If people ask me why I liked it, I don't know, I just do it. But I think when I went into university, after starting up a screen printing business, and I was printing for brands and clothing brands, anyone that really needed merchandise done, I was on that side. But I think it was also having DCA there, had it the exposure to see actually professional artists going in there, and then I'd be like, oh, I want to jump on those big presses, or I want to do a big A0 size print. And it was that kind of, I'm a big printaholic, and I just want to try and print as much as I can on anything, to be honest. So even from then, I started doing it onto ceramics and screen printing onto, then when I was in university, onto wallpaper. And it's always been very much like West African inspired from my designs, like from my dad's side. I think that's a lot of what I'm kind of looking into. Like where I'm from in London is a big community of like Arab, Caribbeans, Africans, South Asians, like everyone's, I'm pretty sure it's one of the blackest areas in the UK. So moving to Scotland was a bit of a culture shock. So like, I find it myself, me doing this art mix of like a foundation for myself. I find it very selfish because it is very much, you know, Scottish, Nigerian, South London inspired, but I just want to, it makes me feel more comfortable being here and doing my work. So a lot of it's through wallpaper and installations, and kind of making like these little like rooms and making my own little fantasy. And I don't know, I'm still working on it bit by bit, but we had commission with the Perth Museum that I mentioned earlier, which just went up in March, which was very good to see, a very proud moment for myself. And last year we had an exhibition at Generator Projects, which was the biggest space I was allowed to really go in. And yeah, it was really fun, to be honest. So I'm hoping to have more opportunities like that to see where it all goes.
Well, it's really good to hear you speak, and I love the term printaholic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we might steal that from.
Yeah, no, definitely.
We've got quite a lot of those.
Yeah, need more printers and mum's boys for the world. That's it. So yeah.
So you've actually neatly answered and embodied, I have to say, the next question that I
Oh,
was going to
brilliant.
ask the panel. So I'm going to actually ask it now to Meg and Frederica. But you'll see when I ask it what I mean. So so the next question is, how can we keep museums' collections relevant to contemporary audiences, including to communities that don't immediately relate to them? Meg, what do you feel? So, you know, we've sort of seen a sort of lively examples of exactly what's happening in real time in terms of the Thames practice, but in terms of what we might do here, what's your sense of how we make things relevant?
Well, I think widening scope is really important. Like, you know, you said there's probably not a lot of South London, Nigerian, Scottish, but there are people like that. And I'm sure it makes a world of difference seeing, you know, stuff that they feel very related to in museums, and especially with, like we were talking about before the panel, you know, one of my degrees is in Scottish history, and there, you know, were people of color in Scotland in the 1500s and 1600s. It's just very not researched and not broadcast, but there is starting to be a lot more work on that, including your work in the Perth Museum. And you know, I think it is important for people to know and to feel welcomed by things like that. But what, like Frederica was saying, with the trails you can do at museums, I saw a really interesting talk by the curators at the Georgian House on Charlotte Square, which, you know, is laid out in a pretty traditional manner with objects, and they have a little history of the objects. But they have little pamphlets you can take around with you that highlight different objects from a queer perspective, highlight different objects from a women's history perspective, and I think there's a couple other ones as well. But yeah, just kind of, you know, widening the scope as much as possible. And I know with our collection, a lot of what we collected maybe up until the 2000s was there are a lot of white men in our collection. But I think we've done a really nice job actually with, you know, inviting people, diverse people to come and work with us, and then we take their prints into our collection. So I think we are working on making it more reflective of, you know, people who are actually here and are actually visiting. And, you know, if we can, if people can see themselves in our collection, I think that'll make us continue to be relevant. Yeah, so it's all about widening reflection.
And Frederica, is there anything else that you would like to add in terms of relevance and how we remain relevant? Your institution has many thousands of visitors every year from people from all walks of life, and has relevance for many different types of people. How do you do that?
Well, it's a really difficult question in a way, because I guess the bigger you are, the more difficult it becomes to move, really. But I would like to say that we need to consider museums not as dusty spaces, but as living entities. And while we might sit behind walls as curators and everyone else who actually runs a museum, so we are still in touch with what happens outside, and often we can't do very much about it because these are political things. But I don't go past, and we continue to reflect on them, and we try to. So automatically you look for objects that in one or the other way can reflect certain issues that that surround us, and that is quite often what keeps us going as curators. So yes, you might do historical research. So you mentioned just at night. I mean, that's what keeps me going probably every day. We're looking into the history, but connecting it with what is around us. And that's how the museum was founded. So it was not a place where there were historical collections. The National Museum was an industrial museum, so very much like your place here. And it was founded in order to offer not necessarily working class, but tradespeople, everyone who had an impact on art and design, but also craftspeople, collections that they could use to compare, to experiment. So there was an expectation that people would come in with knowledge, leave their knowledge in exchange for gaining something else. So it's that kind of contemporary relevance that existed for us now in the past, but I think it is still very much a core of what should drive us and what drives us today. So working with contemporary artists is one of the ways for us to do this, but also working with the communities to give access to the collections, to encourage them to work with this material and to come up with their own ideas, what they would like to do with the material, and to support this, which is not easy,
No,
given with the limited resources that
exactly, and
we
I
have.
and the sort of delicacy of the sort of balance between wanting to embrace the themes of our time, which are complex and challenging and in some instances deeply difficult, but also being sensitive to many different perspectives and views of audiences and how they feel about things, and then the duty that we all have as charities of not appearing to be politically campaigning. So all of those things are complex, but I think your point about working with artists to tell those stories, let's just interrogate that a little bit more in terms of the balance between curator and artist. And I should say to the audience that Frederica was generous enough to contribute to a programme of curatorial learning, which we delivered last year at Edinburgh Printmakers. In fact, we have one of our fellows in the audience, Natasha, who where I remember the learning workshop that you delivered very specifically, and you talked about interpretation and curation, and focus particularly was your points in terms of making work able to be interpreted clearly by an audience. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? So in terms of interpretation, what are the sort of levels of things that curators and museums institutions should think about in being that bridge between a work, an artist, and the audience?
Well, I can't really remember what I did in the workshop, but again, it was very much about, so which is one of my main ideas that I like to promote, is that an object can be seen from so many different perspectives, and an exhibition or whatever you do usually allows only for one way of presenting it, so reminding an audience that it can be seen from many different ways. I think it's one of the main messages that I would like to send here. But working with artists is often a way to offer a new perspective on historical material particularly, which I would think adds then not only at that moment a new perspective, but it changes the life cycle of an object. So I have tried to do a thought experiment about recycling in a museum context, and that centers very much around this idea that you add new sides to an object in terms of interpretation. So you recycle the object, but you add new layers to it. And for me, working with artists is very important. Unfortunately, you can't do this very often, but there are funding opportunities for us. So the Art Fund, for example, has a grant where you can commission an artist, at least to a certain extent, if you find match funding, for example. But these are initiatives that are very important to institutions like us to do this work. And usually it's not just commissioning a work, it starts a whole process for us as curators to think differently. So because you have a dialogue with the artist, there will be community work around. So it's always a medium to transform how we see collections or specific objects. And then the last step is really to make this accessible permanently, yes, but at least temporarily in the galleries and in museums so that you can share it. So creating a legacy for such projects, that's usually where I think is the challenge. Yes, you do these projects, you work with artists, but how do you keep them accessible and usable for other generations?
Thank you. All very astute points, I think. Again, do you have perspectives or views of the relationship between the artist and curator?
Well, I've just really had a couple of opportunities with museums, so it's still very fresh, really approaching it, but I find it a bit quite different compared to installing in a gallery, where I feel like you do have this kind of responsibility of like educating people. I think that's one of the big things about museum is for education. So and kind of the interaction kind of side of it, like you were saying, there's not such thing as a museum that's all dusty and stuff. It's not really the perspective you kind of want to think of it going. So even with how I would think about trying to approach doing stuff, but it'd be mainly along those ways. Yeah, definitely do with education and interactions with like workshops or something engaging, you know, that's usually what you find a lot in my little cousin went to the National Museum actually a couple of weeks ago, and you know they were sending little pictures of the heads through the cutouts, and you know just I think sometimes there's little things like that makes it a lot more just yeah, and it really goes hand in hand, I feel.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us on to the next question, which again, I'm going to ask all three panelists because it's a big question, well, two big questions. So what do you think are the main challenges for museums operating today? And what are your thoughts on how they could be addressed?
Ooh, I think this is a really tricky one, but I think a lot of it comes down to lack of funding, unfortunately. I don't really know. I guess write to your MPs. But yeah, no, like museums are growing and changing as we've all been discussing, and you know, in order for reinterpretations to happen and collections to be upkept, and even, you know, properly fully cataloged. Like, look what happened at the British Museum when their stuff wasn't fully cataloged. You know, that there has to be funding behind it, and I think I'd say that's probably, unfortunately, the largest issue facing museums today is just having the resources to have the staff who can help bring these collections forward and reinterpret them and add to them, while also properly caring for them. But yeah, and thoughts on how things can be addressed is, I guess, just, I don't know. It's a really hard one. With things that are, you know, doable without money. I think, yeah, continuing to reinterpret things is really challenging, especially in larger, older collections. But there's a particular example at National Museum of Scotland that I really love is I think the Singh twins portrait of the Maharaja, who basically was kidnapped by the British and had all his treasures stolen, and some of them wound up in the National Museum. And the way that they've reframed that story to make it about him again and not about, oh, here's a necklace from India, you know, I think is really lovely and really brings a humanity to it. So I think, yeah, as far as challenges go, making things, yeah, relevant and showing the humanity behind the stories. But yeah, that's up to curators just to keep doing good work like you're doing.
So I think you might have just made a compliment. Someone who is quite responsible for that.
I love that. That's my favorite thing in the museum. Actually.
That's really nice to hear.
Yeah.
It has cost me a lot of energy to get there.
Yeah. So thoughts, Frederica, on key challenges, money aside, let's put money aside and just talk about some of the other things perhaps to do with people and perspectives and habits and what are the kind of key barriers to progress as you see them that perhaps we might be able to do something about with some gentle manoeuvring.
Well, I think from a curatorial perspective, I can't really speak for the whole museum because there are so many different aspects to it, which I'm not involved. They are a little bit beyond me because even the small area that I have already enough challenges if you want so, but it is a real privilege to work with these collections, the ones that I have, and I guess my colleagues will feel the same. And the real challenge is not to give up positive thinking that we can actually achieve something, because a day of 7 hours, as it will be the case from the 1st of August per day, we are reducing our working hours, is even shorter to achieve what we want to achieve. And what Maggie, what you mentioned, so documentation, interpretation, they take enormous amounts of time. And yes, you can discover with every object, and I sometimes think nobody has looked at for the last 100 years, it's really time I should do something about it. Then I get stuck in one story and it takes me a whole week to just follow up. Given that I have, I don't know, 20,000 objects, that's an impossible task. So not to give up, I think that is one of the challenges, and just to be able then to focus and just say, okay, I'm only working on this one today, and I leave out of this picture all the things that have not been done. So what I try to do is often to see how I can then reuse the research that I have done and build on small islands basically that I have created for myself, and make them useful, you know, in terms of other research projects, or work with artists on creating something new or commissioning, or if an opportunity for an exhibition comes up, then I can just say, yes, here, please me. It's being prepared for the small opportunities that arise, and they are really small, usually, all of us. So it's being vigilant and jump when you have and see an opportunity to make the most of it.
Let's just write that down. There's some good thoughts there. All salutary advice. Again, if there was one thing that you wish museums would do that they don't do now, what would it be?
Well, I guess it's the obvious one, like give back stolen items. Like I think that's just a subject that needs to be like addressed, and I think even at ways it could be. I think it needs to be done to a certain point to show respect. But I also know it's a very complicated matter, as how, I mean, even when it was, for example, like the Benin sculptures, when there was the Kanu riots, when most of the sculptures were taken up with Nigeria, we had a totally different system and placing, you know, different owners now, and they've been handed around different places. So I know there's, it's not an easy answer or easy solution to do and how to work around it, but I think it would be a very, you know, I think we should be looking at like a lot of our colonial history and the history of slavery and all stolen items, and how much it's benefited everyone here and, you know, on the streets that we walk on. I think it's, I mean, I went to the Hunterian with a friend who is half Moroccan, another friend who is Egyptian as well. And it is sometimes a little bit like weird if you're looking at it in that way as well. And especially from my Scottish side and my Nigerian side conflicting, it would make my Scottish side feel a lot less guilty if we could give some of it back. Or even in ways, I know with some bronzes, like you're saying, connecting with artists, I don't know if possible, if we have maybe artists to recreate some. I know we've had stuff where they had the Benin mask and they made the replica, but I think they sent it back. And I think we could do things I mean, we've got talented artists in the UK. I'm sure there's someone that could make something not exactly like it, but pretty much close to it as it goes. And I think it would be just a really good gesture to the rest of the world, to be honest, as well. So I think that's the main thing. But then again, on that hand, I never really used to think about that. Like when I went to see the Benin masks when I was 18, I used to see it like there's still pros I see. I think a lot of museums should be free as well to go into to see. I think that's like a vital point of accessibility on that education. I don't think you should make education cost, because especially in cost of living times like right now. So like I think there's a lot of ways to really approach it definitely as it goes. But I think, yeah, definitely at least being more open about it and, being open with reflection and honest with ourselves of, how we've been in society and stuff like that. And I think it could hopefully bring it all a bit more happier in this mad world we live in,
Definitely. And do you think we're talking about that enough yet?
Honestly, I've not really been that engaged enough with museums to really give a full-on answer, but I would probably, my assumption would be no, to be honest. Like, I think it's kind of like what you're saying, you need many people in different areas doing different things. Like I can't talk about one minority's like struggles or things because I've not experienced it, or, but obviously vice versa perspective can also help towards getting it more progressive as it goes. So I think, yeah, definitely, like we're saying, broadening the horizon and accessibilities for people to have the opportunities to come in here. And I think it would all naturally, I'd like to hopefully think naturally start happening in that way. So I think it's kind of good that we have these questions, and it's always the hardest questions to feel. And, there's a lot of guilt that feels into it, but I think it's better on our conscience, you know what I mean, as a nation as well, to be honest. I think the rest of the world hopefully would, be a little bit less sour about it afterwards, because I think they've got the right to be,
Well, everyone's nodding in this room right now, so well said, I would say. So now I'm just going to do a time check on how long we have got left. 10 minutes, my goodness. Okay, so let's move swiftly on and start talking about audiences, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. But maybe what I should do is ask the audience what expectations you have of visiting a museum today. Does anybody want to offer any thoughts on that point?
I think for me, and just very quickly, I think context is really important, so I think that's like, you always go to exhibitions, and maybe an exhibition will, like an exhibition in a sense, like what we have, an exhibition that's just been set up temporary, that shows you something, and you go in with the expectation maybe of feeling something and seeing something. Whereas for me, a museum, I expect context of something. So either a relationship with the building, like what we have here, right? So the building fits into the society, and then we connect it with the exhibits. So we have context around it. So I suppose, yeah, context, I think, is quite important.
Thank you. Anyone else just now, or shall I move on to the panel, back to the panel? So I'm going to move on to a question about technology. So, okay, I'm presuming that you're quite savvy when it comes to using tech.
Like sometimes it depends what tech you're talking about.
I know that Meg has a tech project, a sort of social media project, which is sort of in the making. So you could perhaps talk about that. And Frederica, there might be things that you're doing in an innovative way at the museum in relation to technology and reaching out. But let's just take a perspective from Nikem first in terms of how can we use technology in a way that makes collections and artworks more accessible to audiences from your perspective?
I guess, well, we've got the classic one, the internet, which is like the best accessible way. So I think even if it was just the top of my head, just like having that, like I was saying before, you need that information being free, and a lot of people have got access, most people have got access, not everyone, to the internet, but that could be just similar ways on just having it, just the simplest ways there. And I think even for myself, you know, a lot of my generation, we get distracted easily. So I think that's a kind of that kind of relationship in, you know, I think there's a few technical strategies for there's some whiz kids could probably help on my side too, where you don't get bored after the 5 clicks like I'm quite guilty of, I'll be honest, sometimes. So I do think a lot to do with that. But even just like even at the Perth Museum, they had like a little wildlife area with physical, like life-size kind of versions of whatever they had. But I can't really name every single animal they had there, but you could actually go there and actually press the button, hear what they used to sound like back then. I think that's the kind of interactive kind of side, especially for kids, you know, and that side of, you know, that can make it like spark a kind of interest. You never know, or you know, and who knows where it could go from there, I guess. So.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ask the other two panelists for succinct, short examples of tech in museums context.
Oh, well, so I'm working on a project here that's connecting kind of prints that were made here that are in public collections with, you know, prints that are in private collections and people's personal collections. And so that's going to be a really neat thing. But what springs to mind immediately with this is kind of like, you know, Frederica was saying earlier, you know, there's one of her and 20,000 objects. She doesn't have the time to necessarily interpret things, but I think it might just be the social media circles I follow. There's been a huge rise in content creation around things in museums. And if they're available online for people to look at, and there's information available online for them to research, there are a lot of content creators making really in-depth interpretive videos about things in museums that they don't work in. And I think that is really helping bring some of these stories to light that, you know, curators don't necessarily have the time or resources to do all on their own for their whole collection. I think that's a really amazing way that technology and museums have been interacting recently.
Thank you. Frederica, any other thoughts on technology? Is it useful
I'm
or
a
not?
great fan of handling objects, but I know not everyone can do this, or seeing front and back. But I have been involved in a project that is Art UK, I think. It's The Power of Looking, if you want to look it up. And they came to film one of the Singh twins paintings. So from the Iqbal Name series, where Iqbal Singh has a gathering at his house, and you have a lot of people who depict actually real people. And I had an interpreter, and she was able to bring this painting to life, telling the story. So it addresses children and tries to bring them into, or to engage them with, the artwork. So I loved it, even if I'm not a child anymore. So I hope really very much that people will use it. So I'm not entirely sure how much or how much people engage with it. I mean, I use other collections in order to look things up, but I think to have individual objects that are studied in depth or presented in depth is probably a better way than spread it thinly and have a lot.
Yeah, I think that, and I just think it's a way of taking things out into people's homes. I've noticed that The Guardian in advertising cultural events now talks about going out things that you have to go out to do and things that you can actually do at home by connecting with your device. Now, I know we've only got a little short time to go, but I would like to take any questions if anybody in the audience would like to ask any of our panelists anything about anything that they've said this evening. Paul.
Just a general question for all of the panelists. So if you're thinking about the future when Printmakers has a museum, or is a museum, and you could think of one thing that you would like, that for you would be critical to see to make that museum a success, what would that thing be?
What I love about this place is that in the old sense of the industrial museum, you have the making part and you have these objects. So don't lose this. So bring them in whatever way together so that what you were saying about your brothers, cousins and so on, it's the tactile thing. So we need to get people back to the actual understanding how things are made, and how you can use them creatively to express your joys, anxieties, everything. So it's a kind of channeling also for your own mental health, I think, what this place can offer.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Actually, I think that's a brilliant idea. I think especially having the print studio and a gallery or wherever it's being displayed, I think it shows the journey as well. Like when I go to the DCA print studio, they would have the galleries there, the print studio downstairs, and it's such this there's a cycle that goes on around there, and you won't notice if you just go to a gallery or just a print studio. You won't know what happens to these prints. They look lovely, great there, but then especially from an outside perspective, it makes a lot more sense in that way. So I think, yeah, that's that and big walls, big prints, small prints, a variety of everything to suit printaholics like myself. So.
May.
Well, I touched on this a little bit at the members meeting the other night, but I'd really love to see our collections start reflecting more of the members who are working here every day. We do have members' prints in our collection, but much more it's things we've commissioned, artists we've had, visiting artists and things like that. But I think widening the collection and bringing in a lot more of the people who are here every day, I think is really important to me and to Christina, the other collections development manager. So that's the one thing I'd really love to see for our collection is to have it really be, I know I've said this a lot, but like have it truly be a reflection of this institution as it is now.
Fantastic. So I'm going to wrap up there. Does anybody have any other burning questions, or you have to chat afterwards? Oh, here we go.
Any comment? It's not a question, it's more just like a statement that's up for discussion. But there's something I think called a traveling gallery or something like that. And I wondered, if more institutions, especially around Edinburgh, might be open to having a space that communities can rent out, and just to help with the accessibility, to help to get people through the doors, interact both with the collections here, and then the people who regularly come here can see the collections of those communities. So yeah, just wanted to, like, for example, this room, fantastic, so space like this could open up for community groups to have, occasional kind of exhibitions.
Yeah, we're definitely on that one. That's important to us too. So I'm going to round up there. I'm taking away my takeaways. I'm going to go back to printaholics.
Yeah.
Printing the t-shirt. Maybe we'll talk to you about that.
Yes.
Frederica said something really pertinent, which really resonated with me, is that point about not to give up. So in the face of all the difficult stuff that we have to deal with all the time, just not to give up and to cherish the small things that are the baby steps towards where you want to go, which feels like very salutary advice. And Meg said, widening the collection and embracing everyone, really reaching out and making sure that we are sort of living the talk that we put into funding applications around inclusivity and EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, but actually living and breathing that and making that happen in reality so people feel it in every which way. So I think all of those things are really important. I think this has been a really good conversation. Thank you for taking the time to be with us and gift to us your wisdom, and also to the audience for being here this evening, and for Ilaria for setting it all up and organising it. It's been a really important conversation, I think, and I'm delighted to say we've recorded it so that others can watch it in the future. So thank you to you all, and let's give you a clap. And that's us for now, and we will be reconvening in 2 weeks' time, 1 week's time. Oh yes, 1 week's with another talk if you'd like to come. So thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Great.